today with Matt Taibbi. I hope I'm pronouncing that well.
Taibbi, yep.
Taibbi, okay, great. Matt, thank you for joining us on The Common Bridge. Of course, The Common Bridge is the fiercely nonpartisan podcast and now YouTube channel where we discuss policy, we discuss how to solve the problems of the day, how to seize the opportunities of the moment with many distinguished guests. And we have with us today author and journalist. So welcome to The Common Bridge.
Thank you for having me.
You're writing for Rolling Stone and others, and your books, which you have the best book titles, Insane Clown President is a great title, and Hate Inc. And I found those to be very attractive. And you wrote an article earlier this month called "We Need a New Media System." Tell our audience of The Common Bridge about that, please.
Yeah, this is based on the ideas that are in the book. You referenced Hate Inc., which is really a story about how the commercial model of the news business, which I grew up in, my father was also a reporter, how that's changed in the last 40 years. You know, we used to, back in the days of, the three networks, the commercial strategy was to go for the whole audience. And now with the advent of cable and the internet and the atomization of the news landscape, the dominant strategy commercially is to pick a demographic and just try to dominate it by feeding it news that we know that they will like and that will reinforce their views. And that's sort of the Fox strategy. You know, we know we're going to give this audience what they're going to respond to, but that's also what goes on the other side with MSNBC, CNN. And the problem with that is that it heavily incentivizes news companies to kind of demonize each other's demographics. And there's no incentive to really kind of play things down the middle or, balance is a word that's become tainted in journalism. But I think it's an important word. There's no incentive to that because your audiences aren't going to respond and they're not going to stay. So, what I was proposing is basically, maybe someday we'll create a new framework that will attempt to try to figure out how to have a news business that doesn't depend on stirring up audiences against each other, is the idea.
I think you have a term of art. Is it called outrage center or writing to the outrage center? Is that one of your terms or is that a term of art?
Yeah, I do use that. I'm not sure whether that's mine or whether I plucked it from somewhere, but I definitely talk about that. I mean, that's the idea. And I've worked in media for almost 30 years now, and that's mostly what we're doing. You know, we all know who our audiences are, and we know what they're going to respond to. And, if you work in Fox News, you know that if you do a story about some absurd, over-the-top woke episode on a campus somewhere, that your audience is going to go nuts about it. Same with us. When I worked for Rolling Stone and I did a story about how loopy Michelle Bachmann was or whatever it was, our audiences eat that stuff up, and there's not a whole lot of incentive to try to tone down that instinct in your audiences.
I actually watched when you authored an objective article, but it wasn't following the talking points of the kind of left-leaning part, and boy, did the knives come out. You were like the guy, and then it was, well, wait a minute, why is he writing this now? Like, traitor. Maybe I'm overstating the case. What do you think?
No. This is a thing that became very common after Trump arrived on the scene. It's interesting. In my career, actually, one of the things that actually boosted my career early was the perception that I was willing to criticize in all directions. I did a lot of reporting after the financial crisis that was heavily critical of Democrats for their various policy failures leading up to that crisis. And at the time, the journalistic consensus was, well, that's good. That's fairness. That means that we can trust this kind of reporting. But once Trump came on the scene, that fell out of favor. And the idea of just sort of calling things as you see them, suddenly that became a crime that we call false equivalency or false balance or whatever it is. And it became an accepted tenet of the profession that it's the journalist's responsibility to help push the audience in the correct electoral direction, which I think is not what we're supposed to be doing, but that is now basically the hegemonic belief within the business.
Yeah, and I don't think this started necessarily with Trump. And I recall the first press conference that President Obama had in the White House, and the New York Times reporter asked him, how he was finding the job so far. And one of the questions was, what part of it was he finding most charming? I mean, you talk about hard-hitting journalism,
Right.
and then throughout that, they redid 1/7 of the economy in the healthcare bill. By the way, I'm a healthcare guy. I actually read that, bill start to finish, and I've read the Medicare for All bill, and I read the Clinton Care bill when that was in. That was the business I was in. So I was waiting for anybody, PBS, I don't care, somebody to sit down and say, okay, here's the healthcare financing methods we have today, and here's what's going to change and what it's going to mean to you. Still waiting to get that report. And people want to know what it is. Why is it that we have this crazy patchwork? And I've had 6 people on my podcast, if you count me as a knowledgeable healthcare person, coming from all different perspectives, and we all arrive on the same fundamental framework about what needs to be done. And it's frankly not that hard, and it's frankly overdue. But the people that we actually hire to do this won't do it, that we elect, and the people that are supposed to report on it don't. So,
Right.
So I was intrigued with where this can go from here. And so when I saw the title about a new media system, my mind went to, why can't people like you be part of the, it's now digital, but what used to be print, but the written word, with some video, with maybe some hyper local reporting, which there's quite a lot of that going on that's pretty good,
Yeah.
coupled with a news summary of the day. And, what's stopping that from being formed?
It's a great question because, and look, there are people talking about it, as we speak. There are high profile people in journalism who are discussing the possibility of creating kind of a new corporate enterprise that would seek to do this. But the problem is, it's not really in anybody's interests. It's not, to do it that way. You'd have to have a kind of a dissenting CEO with a lot of money to spare to pour into this new venture, who's willing to kind of buck conventional wisdom. And we have had people do that, but right now the way things are is perfectly acceptable to most of the people who hold power in this country. They like, if you go back and listen to George Carlin talk about this, and
Oh yeah.
in the
Oh yeah.
I guess late 2000s, maybe 2008, and he was talking about, the last thing the people who actually own this country want is a population that's capable of critical thinking, and the way we have things now is a hyper divided system in which everybody is basically on one team or another, and they're so busy talking past each other and lobbing insults and threats at each other that they don't really stop to think about what's going on. And you bring up healthcare; it's a massive issue in the lives of everybody. And having covered presidential campaigns, I know from listening to both Republicans and Democrats that people are deeply, profoundly furious about healthcare. I mean, you take your kid to an emergency room, and you might walk out with a $50,000 bill just for
Right.
staying overnight for a case of the croup or something like that. And if you don't have, if you're not covered, it can be like a crippling incident in your life. Uh,
Worse,
Everybody's mad
worse
about
as you think you're covered,
Right.
and you
Yes,
think, and
exactly.
you think that ER is in network, And then you find out, oh, wait a minute, that's a different physician group. And yeah, the ER is covered, but the two doctors that looked at your child aren't covered. And it's an insane system.
I mean, there are so many things. I mean, I have friends who are doctors, so it's a personal like bugbear for me. But just to take an example, you could get in a car accident, be unconscious, and be helicoptered somewhere without your consent. You never agreed to it, and you'll wake up with $150,000 bill for a helicopter ride, and that's not covered, right?
Well,
Uh,
here's the secret about that. Um, on the admission forms, always insert, you can say you're liable for charges, just insert for covered in network charges. And
mhm.
then also when you get that bill, don't pay it,
Right, right.
because it'll wend its way through. The computer systems behind this are just absolutely horrible. And the insurance hasn't even adjudicated the claim before it falls out and it's slipping over to patient responsibility. Um, but this kind of knowledge is in the country.
Hmm.
It's in a lot of places, but it's not being brought any place. And if you think about, a person that's engaged in a job or a profession and they come home and they want to be a responsible citizen, and all right, what are their choices at night? ABC, NBC, CBS, all right, CNN, MSNBC, Fox. They're probably missing someone there.
PBS, yeah.
PBS, yeah, all kind of from the same playbook, and they don't have another alternative. And just in the short time that we've been doing this podcast, we hear from both the newsmakers saying, hey, I appreciate that I get time to talk about the issue, like policing. Let's go to, this sheriff and in 30 seconds tell us what we need to do about policing in the United States. It's an impossible job. And then from the audience, they're saying, I just feel like I'm not getting any information. And I've kind of the mind when I hear that word about a new media, again, I go to all of the good reporting like you're doing and the hyper local report and some of the better podcasts. It's just really bringing that together in a gateway. And I think a corporate structure with corporate control would not work. I think there's a not for profit element to this. I think there's some user pay to this. And I think there's some basically free content in this. But look, when you turn on CNN, you know what you're going to get, right? You turn on Fox, you know what you're going to get, and
Well, which is not to interrupt, but that tells you right there that it's not news because the news by its nature is surprising and confusing. So
so
if you yeah. Hmm.
and I'm trying to promote this. You can hold two thoughts in your head. We can all say, okay, Donald Trump was a terrible choice for president, and he didn't know the job. He didn't want to learn the job, and he's got massive personal problems, which happens to be my point of view. All right. And at the same time, say that the FBI misbehaved, which they did. And I pointed this out to a very knowledgeable legal person. I said, look, James Comey, Sally Yates, okay, Rod Rosenstein, all asked under oath in a Senate hearing, if you knew then what you know today about the contents of the FISA warrant application, would you have approved it? All three answered no. That didn't make any of the news. And when I, in an email exchange with this very good, highly knowledgeable person, the response back was, oh, where'd you get that? Fox News? I said, no, C-SPAN live during the day.
Right.
Okay. But it didn't, but the first reaction was, I don't like that fact. You must have got it from a bad place. That really speaks to how corrupt the media world has become.
Yeah, and we've conditioned our audiences to react negatively to news that disappoints their narrative expectations, right? So, the example that you cite, another piece of news that's in that same vein, it came out in declassified testimony that Andrew McCabe, the deputy FBI director, that way back in August of 2016, they had moved on from George Papadopoulos as a target to Carter Page because he said the evidence, quote, didn't particularly indicate that Papadopoulos was actually communicating with any Russians, which tells you that the entire predicate for that FBI investigation was flawed from the beginning. When that came out in the Horowitz report, which again is not
Yep.
that's not a right wing thing. It was an inspector general report. The headlines in all of the newspapers that had hyped this story were instead focused on the idea that the start of the investigation was legal, that it had been done without bias,
Mhm.
but it didn't tell us the important information that there was a problem, and that's what happens when you behave that way. Audiences see it, and they stop trusting, and that's why we've had results like, there was a poll this week showing that only 46% of the country trusts the media. It's stuff like that that contributes to the problem. Like, sometimes you have to just suck it up and tell people the news, that even if you don't like it, you know.
Right. And so this was I was watching CNN, and part of my diligence on news scanning, and they're complaining, well, why doesn't anybody believe us? It's like, I mean, which fake story were you flogging do we want to use as the example? What story didn't you actually try to get facts out on that we can use? What about your owner saying his job is to take down a certain president? It's like, that's why people don't trust you. And how did they get to the arrest, at a, when we sent, I don't know, 27 guys to arrest a 70-year-old, including a helicopter and an armored vehicle at 6 a.m. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I mean, look, people like Jeff Zucker came from the entertainment wing of the business, and they understand the news as an entertainment product, which is frankly correct given the way that the business is structured. Um, I mean, it's morally and ethically abhorrent, but from their point of view, they're trying to create something that they know is going to drive a lot of audience, and so yes, they're creating a narrative that creates villains and heroes, and Donald Trump wears the black hat, and the forces in the CIA and the FBI, they wear the white hats. But this is a format that's been repeated back and forth over and over again. Sorry, let's just put it down. Thanks, buddy. Sorry about that.
Not a problem. I love it.
It's it's a format that we've had going back and forth over and over again for decades, but it's gotten so much worse in the Trump era. And the problem is that, again, audiences see this. They want the people in the news to have a sense of detachment about what they're reporting. Like, we're not supposed to really care about what the outcomes of political events are. We're supposed to be hyper focused on what's already a very difficult job of getting things correct. And the primary preoccupation of reporters, and I know this from growing up because I have so many people who are friends who are in the business, it used to be this panic of getting it wrong. Like, every time you did a story, you had trouble going to sleep at night because you were afraid you got something in the story wrong. And the previous generation of journalists all have that. Now they don't, because we all know that our audiences are going to forgive us if we miss a little bit, but as long as our hearts are in the right place,
Right.
they're okay
Right.
with that, which is a major sign of a problem.
And see, I think that the partisan attacks from what should be a detached, objective press actually was their undoing. Think if just put the camera on Donald Trump. So I watched him, and it's like, remember when he did the thing about what was it? Person, man, woman, camera, TV.
Oh, I don't remember that. No. Yeah.
Okay, so I happened to be. I watched that interview live, and he said, "Well, give me this cognitive test," and it's nothing. Like, you'd have to have serious brain damage not to pass this. But he went on and on. He goes, "Oh, the doctors had never seen anything like this before. They couldn't believe it." And he went on for minutes, and I was watching this going, does he really believe that? Or does he think we're that dumb? Either one is a problem, and he shouldn't be the president of the United States.
Right.
But instead, what's on the news is, what did, Adam Schiff cook up today? Or, anonymous in the White House who was, a senior level advisor who turned out to be a kid, probably didn't even shave every day. It's like what are we buying into here? And
Yeah.
CNN, you go on, they're saying, hey, your old demented, CNN is saying that our old demented guy is better than Fox's old crazy guy. And that's what the, most powerful position in the world. That's the debate we're having.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
insane.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're right. And, that those narratives that were cooked up by the shifts of the world actually became one of the only things that sustained Trump's ability to be politically viable across 4 years. It was his best card to play when he went to
Yep.
speak. I mean, I covered both his campaigns. This one less than the last one because of the pandemic, but when he went to crowds, that was his go-to line, was going against the media, talking about the news stories that they had drummed up against him, and because he was correct in a lot of those cases, it really resonated with a lot of people because he had solved his own accessibility problem with ordinary working class Americans, Trump being, ostensibly a billionaire, by turning the CNNs of the world, the anchors of those programs, into the class enemy.
Yeah.
And he succeeded in doing it because they overreached, and
They played right into his narrative.
exactly. And if they hadn't done that, like the predominant thinking in our business is, oh, we had to do this because we had to stop him. But it's not. Journalists aren't superheroes. Our job is just to tell people what's going on, and then somebody else has to do the stopping. Like that's the and we just don't see it that way now, and that's a problem.
Let's kind of zero in a little bit on solutions. So my general thesis is that we have three bad guys in the group. It's the Republican Party, it's the Democratic Party, and it's the news reporting industry. I refuse to call them journalists because they're not. They're not fulfilling the role of journalists and a free press. I believe that trying to undo Democrats or Republicans with a third party is probably futile. They've really cemented themselves in, but they do have great survival instincts, and I think that they will respond to enough pressure. And so similarly on news reporting, why can you keep producing garbage? Well, the answer is very simple. People keep consuming it. All right. So how do we get on the other side of that? Because it doesn't take a lot to look. And I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly, but do you know the first fellow, Andy NGO?
Oh, Andy, no, yeah.
Yeah. And so I've seen a lot of his videos and things and what he's reporting from Portland and from Seattle and so forth. And I'm like, okay, that looks bad. What date was that? What angle was that? And is there any corroboration? Because if what he's reporting is true, it's being really underreported and nobody's picking it up. And I only use him as an example is that we need to get to a standard that this group or this ecosystem of reporting is trying to do an honest, fair job.
Yeah, so he's an interesting case. There was an episode yesterday that really brought out the weirdness around that. He tweeted out an interesting piece of information, which was that Twitter had just shut down a series of accounts ostensibly connected to Antifa, and that was an interesting piece of news because a lot of people on the progressive left have been cheering a lot of the censorship and speech suppression because they think it's only going to impact their political opponents. So a few reporters, people like Glenn Greenwald, myself, we kind of retweeted that information, and the immediate reaction was to pile on because, oh, you retweeted, and you know who's
Hmm.
who's a fascist or whatever it is, right? And I actually don't follow Andy all that well. I know of him, but this is a pretty common phenomenon now in media. It's, well, we're not going to cover an issue, um, but if you actually consume any coverage by the person who does pay attention to the issue, we're going to denounce you for doing that.
Yes.
So, and it's similar to the phenomenon of, like, you know, Glenn Greenwald doesn't get invited on, um, sort of CNN, MSNBC, any of those channels. He's been kind of like a lot of reporters, kind of blackballed from those kinds of invitations. But then he goes on Fox News, and they get on his case for going on Fox.
Right.
Well, you got, it's pick one or the other. Like, either do the work yourself, either examine the issues yourself, or demonize the person, right? But they don't do either. So that, I guess it's a long way of saying, like, okay, the issues that Andy knows and looking at, which are like Antifa protests or whatever, the only real coverage of that has been basically to dismiss the idea that it exists, and I don't think that's true. I mean, I think it's totally fine to do reports that say, well, this is a real phenomenon. I don't know how big or dangerous it is, but let's look at it, And they're not doing that, and that just lends more and more credence to probably his audience.
Yeah, and so to that specific topic, we do know there are things going on. I want to know, okay, who are these people? Who's equipping you? How did you know to show up there at that time? Why did you employ the tactics? What do you hope to achieve? Basic questions, right? And then people can either reject that particular movement or they can join it. But this notion that it doesn't exist is nonsense because we can see it. And even Ted Wheeler, the mayor of Portland, after months of denying it, said, "Yeah, there's Antifa and anarchists in our city, and they're a problem." It's
Yeah.
like
Well,
he
I
was a
mean,
little slow on the uptake, okay, but he got there.
yeah, and there were demonstrations on Inauguration Day, um, in Portland, and there was, it wasn't like wide scale violence, but there were a couple of businesses that had their windows smashed, and that got some headlines. Uh, you can't say it's not. There's nothing there. There clearly was a significant amount of um, unrest this summer, and again, from a news perspective, you don't have to have a take on it. You just have to go and document it.
Yeah.
And this was a problem that I think was pervasive during the summer protests about police brutality. And again, I wrote two books about police brutality. It's like an important issue to me. But the the idea that,
What are the titles of those books? And just talk to our audience would love to hear about this.
yeah, I wrote a book called "I Can't Breathe" about the killing of Eric Garner,
Hmm.
um, and I wrote a book called "The Divide," which is sort of about the difference between how white collar criminals and street criminals are prosecuted. And so I did a lot of work on street policing, stop and frisk, uh, sort of community policing techniques, and how they've changed over the years. And there's all kinds of horrific stuff that we could get into if you wanted, but the point is, I get a lot of what the protesters were being upset about over the summer. I was in tune with all of that stuff, but you can't say that there was no disruption whatsoever. I mean, there were communities where there were elderly people who couldn't get their medication because the local pharmacy had been destroyed. There were small businesses that were disrupted. Um, you can't just whitewash that out and say it didn't happen. Um, you have to document it, and
Right.
there was a kind of a movement within a lot of the newsrooms to say, well, let's not do that story because it'll give credence to the idea that this movement is not righteous or whatever it is. It's not our job to make that determination, you know, and that's what worried me.
Yeah, and look, 500 people go and loot a Target store. That's a story, right? What happened to the Target store? And the nadir for me was in Chicago during one of the mostly peaceful protests, as they've been captioned. They smashed the windows in the Ronald McDonald House. And, Ronald McDonald House, just one function: take care of the families of kids that are really, really ill, and
Right.
while they're getting care. And I couldn't get anybody on the left to denounce that at all. That's just a thing we have to deal with. Um, and as I'm watching the my friends on the right, my friends on the left divide over, I said something to the effect that I thought that the president deserved impeachment on the second impeachment. I think this, my humble opinion, I think he violated his oath of office.
Mm-hmm.
He did it over a period of months, and a talk show host probably, shouldn't do that. A candidate definitely shouldn't, and a president never. Period.
Right.
And that's going to get adjudicated. I'm happy to see it getting adjudicated. But at the same time, I said, look, if you were, one of the people, flogging these fake stories, just to your point earlier about that gave Trump cover, I just said kindly STFU, and spare me the pearl clutching if you were condoning, fiery arson over the summer. Just, arson's arson. Okay, it's not good arson or bad arson. And if you think about like the reporting that went around the mayors of Olympia, Seattle, and Portland, they were peaceful demonstrations, summers of love, until they came into their neighborhoods in their front yards. Then they were rioters and criminals.
Right. Right.
So
And yeah. There are like sort of match sets of stories with completely different approaches. So
yes,
in September, Trump's Attorney General William Barr sort of suggested that he might start prosecuting the people behind the Chaz zone or whatever they call it in Seattle for sedition, and that word sedition triggered this sort of avalanche of what one friend of mine calls a gastitude among a lot of the pundit class, because oh my God, what an incredibly powerful and non-specific governmental prosecutorial tool they're going to unsheath to go after these protesters. You know, like that's a tool that should be handled with care. It's a word that you shouldn't use except in the most extreme of circumstances. And it in the Capitol riot, I actually understand the use of it with respect to certain people involved in that fiasco. But within a couple of days, it was being expanded to cover not just Trump, but anybody who ever voted for Trump.
right.
And it was, an exactly opposite reaction, right? Like, if you're supposed to be careful with the word in the first time around, we should be careful with it the second time around. But it's it's a different approach to the job where we're not thinking about. It's more about the people we're covering as opposed to the principles that we're covering.
Right, and that the attack on the voters of the other candidate, was the big thing that struck me in 2016 when Hillary Clinton went after, and this is a prepared line, by the way, of Trump's voters. And you stand in the public square as a candidate, you're going to get attacked fairly and unfairly. Guess what? That comes with the territory. Buck up. You got to deal with this. But when the attacks started going against the actual citizenry, I think that's where we broke through. And I think it launched this like competitive virtue signaling that you see on all kinds of media, that, hey, I think better than you, therefore I'm better than you because I can parrot certain lines. And the media started flogging that. Now, Matt, as a student and a deep participant, if you look at the arc of things like the Duke lacrosse case, the UVA rapist, where Obama was born, the I don't know, obviously lying Christine Blasey Ford, um, the whoppers that Trump would tell and have echoed to, throughout the right wing media. Does this all link together? And how do we get out of this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's linked because the the regulatory framework, the thing that's designed to prevent the spread of falsehoods is accountability to your audience. But when you have a divided audience, um, your own audience doesn't care if you screw up in the other direction. So when Trump talks about, how they stole the election, or there were, 3 million undocumented people who voted for Hillary Clinton, or whatever it was, his audiences probably don't care that it's not true. So those things get to circulate over and over again, and it's an echo chamber that just continues echoing because that's the nature of these things. But the same phenomenon goes on the other side. You know, if you um, if you tell a story about Trump being like a literal agent for Vladimir Putin, or that it's the beginning of the end of his presidency, and then we can expect indictments, which is what we were told in the middle of March 2018, um, and then that doesn't happen. Uh, the reason we can do that is because our audiences don't particularly care. They're forgiving, and that's a feature now of media on both sides. Um, mhm.
Indeed, that there are people that still hung on to there's still people that accuse Trump of being pro-Russian. And I remember when that story first broke, I said, here's a guy in his 70s, in the public eye, most of his adult life. And he decided, I think I'm going to run for president. And let's see, Russians are the way to go.
Right.
Like, I said, look, I'm willing to hear the facts. Okay. And during the whole Mueller investigation, when the left and many of my friends on the left were frothing at the mouth and saying, oh, we're going to get this guy. And, the little crawlers are going to the bottom of the left wing media
Breaking.
saying,
Yeah.
yeah, breaking news, the walls are closing in, the end is near. And I'm saying, and I just said, well, I said, with the resources, uh, investigative resources, the money, the time, unprecedented access, including breach of client attorney privilege that Robert Mueller has, I said, if there's something there, they're going to find it. And I'm content to wait till the report to come out. And the report comes out, it's like, never mind, but we might have some process crimes that wouldn't have existed had we not done this.
Right. Yeah.
So but because the accusation was made, that stink is going to be out there forever. I mean,
Oh yeah, and it was very conspicuous that the entire Russiagate story was absent from all of the autopsies of the 2020 election. It was like it never
that's
happened,
right.
right? I mean, again, I lived in Russia for 11 years, and the Sovietness of our approach to memory now is just striking, right? Like, this was the biggest issue in the Trump presidency for 3 years. He was dogged by these accusations constantly. And, did they have an effect on him? Did they have an effect on the country? What was the impact of that story on the national psyche? Nothing. It's a non-issue. It's like it's been erased. And this is a new tendency in American media. I mean, we've seen a recent example. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were told to expect, um, armed demonstrations in all 50 capitals, right? And FBI leaked reports to all the major news agencies. They said there was a memo telling us to expect a massive uprising, and it doesn't materialize. And okay, fine. Like, it's fine to say, well, maybe they were deterred by the show of force, whatever it is, but they didn't even do that. They didn't even address it. So it's psychologically damaging to audiences to constantly hype up threats and then just pretend they didn't happen, like or that the experience of being threatened never happened, and that's what we're doing to people.
Indeed, and that to me is one of the biggest crimes that we have in the media today. It's all about alarmism and threatening, so that it stays there. And in your earlier career, were you ever kind of directed to do that? Like, hey, we've got to write something provocative because we need eyeballs or we need clicks or whatever. How
It
how were
doesn't
you getting measured as a reporter?
it doesn't really work like that. You know, if you ever read Noam Chomsky's book Manufacturing Consent, which is I read as a teenager, it's really interesting because he's never worked in media, but he gets a lot of it right. Like um, reporters kind of are trained to internalize the values of their business. And so you just kind of learn by the way that your editors react to certain things that they're going to like some stories and they're not going to like other things. And so by the time you're old enough to be doing front page stories, uh, you've already been trained internally to recognize that this is a story and that's not a story. And I really, really tried hard to break out of that mold in my career. In fact, one of the things that I really worked hard to do was to try to popularize things that most people considered boring, like explaining what a subprime mortgage fraud case looked like or
Yes,
things like that,
yes.
right? So you take something that people don't really want to deal with and you have to work extra hard to make it interesting. The most of the time though we have the opposite incentive, and especially nowadays when you can quantify so exactly what's going on with your audiences. When whether you're working on a platform like Substack, like I do now, or whether you work at the New York Times, you know how many people are reading, you know where they're coming from, what sites they're visiting through, how they learn about your story, and so you're heavily incentivized to make things more sensational or to appeal to certain audiences, and it's a difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah, look, my brand promise is that every listener will find something to not like in every one of my episodes. Okay. And so I tell people, if you're going to come here expecting to get affirmation, don't. You know where to go for that.
Hmm.
But I'm going to be, equally as strong and as factual as I can be on everyone. And I actually wrote a little thing called "Holding Two Thoughts in Your Head," that people think things are all one way, and they're not. And I think this gets us to the polarization of politics, where we have people clamoring for, okay, Medicare for all, and they don't understand what's that bill basically says. The Secretary of HHS controls every penny of healthcare spend with no guardrails, period. That's what's in the bill. Okay, so it's not Medicare, and it's just a massive control of healthcare resources. That's what's in the bill. I've read it. When we look at things like firearms, we have 320 million firearms in private hands, and of course, the framers put the Second Amendment there because they were afraid at some point in time people couldn't go hunting with guns. They just gotten back from a hunting trip, but you're not going to take 300 million firearms out of the country, all right? But at the same time, there's people that shouldn't have them. And so I suggested a graduated licensing plan for firearms. Okay. So that, you know, just like we don't let a, first time pilot jump in the seat of a 747. We just don't do it. Yet in some states, an 18-year-old can go into a gun shop, buy an automatic or semi-automatic rifle, and buy 1,000 rounds of ammunition and walk out. Now, you can't tell me the person behind the counter doesn't have some hint that that's a problem,
Right.
but they have no way of touching it. You look at student debt, okay, which frankly is loan sharking because your balance goes up, okay, just like loan sharks do. And who benefits? And you look around and you say, all right, there's a university with billions of dollars in an endowment, and they're soliciting students to come here to improve your future at the same time knowing they're laying so much debt on them that they are imperiling their future. I mean, it's a moral outrage, and the beneficiaries are universities that are piling up these massive, billions and billions of dollars in endowments and impoverishing kids. It's that we need to get after that. But where's the story about that? Um,
Yeah, no, it's difficult because, and I've written a bunch of student loan stories, and the problem with that, as with a lot of other narratives, is that we tend to sort of commoditize issues and simplify them for audiences. So you take the gun issue, there's pro-gun stories, there's anti-gun stories, right? There's not a whole lot of, well, let's look holistically at the whole thing and try to figure out a way that we can address some of these issues step by step, right? Like that kind of approach is just absent from media. With student loans, you're either deemed pro-student or anti-student, right? So even though it's very clear that the hyper availability of government debt is actually a significant driver of the increase in tuition costs, which is part of the reason that this crisis has snowballed so much. It's like a vicious cycle. Like everybody has to go to college, everybody can get debt. Uh, the universities know it. They keep jacking up prices, and now it's outstripping inflation, whatever. But if people will interpret any kind of idea of, well, maybe we should do something about making government loans maybe less easily available, then that's being against social mobility or whatever it is.
mhm.
Um, so there's a tendency to try to drive the nuance out of coverage. With Trump, it was another example. Like you talked about Hillary's deplorables comment. I covered Trump, and I interviewed a lot of his supporters, and there were definitely, without question, people at his events who freaked me out, who were like openly like unquestionably like racist, and said things that like were shocking to me, that I hadn't heard in America in a while. And then I would, two rows down, I would interview some 60-year-old grandmother who's just like, oh yeah, I loved his reality show,
Mhm.
and they were completely out to lunch in like in a different way. Like, I would ask the question, what does liking him in a reality show have to do with his fitness for the presidency? And there's just nothing there. Those are two completely different phenomena, but that is too complicated for the press. Like you talk about two thoughts, there were hundreds of weird reasons why people voted for Trump, but they reduced it all down to one or two, and in the process, I think they missed a lot that was important. So yeah, I totally understand what you're saying.
And well, I think a lot of Trump's vote was anti-Hillary vote.
Oh, of course, of
And
course, yeah.
just, look, I vote in a swing state, Michigan, and we were bombarded with two negative Hillary, attack ads by Hillary Clinton, like every single commercial break. You got one or the other. And then about every, I don't know, 10 or 15 times there'd be, a Trump ad talking about restarting factories and the like. Um, and I don't know who was advising Hillary Clinton to not do a ground game. And I don't know who was advising her to bring up the Billy Bush tape, because I can tell you there were Democrat women, staunch Democrats. I won't vote for her because she slut shamed a 23-year-old, and defended a serial, sexual abuser. And it's like, and I was, asked on things, how would I advise the Democratic Party? I said I would tell Hillary to pick out one thing that she's done that's benefited other people, and I would just hammer that home. Give people a place to go. Never came up with anything that she had done for other people. And Trump rode that. I mean, and so he never had to have people face the full reality of a guy whose executive talents is all about by the seat of his pants. He roars a lot, but he doesn't follow through. And so, then they come up, well, he colluded with Russia. And I'm like, I don't think this guy's organized enough to collude with anybody. He'd have to like stay on a plan for a period of time. I
Yeah,
don't
for
think,
more than 8 seconds at a time.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think he has the attention span to collude with anybody. And I think he'd be dumb enough if he thought it would move his approval rating up or get him attention. He'd talk about it on national TV or something.
Right. Look at what a great deal I just
Yeah,
pulled
right,
off. Right.
exactly
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Hey, I pulled one off on you. So, we end up, and so, we moved to 2020, and, the Democrats are coming downstream, and it looks like Bernie Sanders is probably going to get the nomination. And they go, well, we can't have that. So we get everybody to drop off. And so, well, we're going to settle on Joe. Okay. So Clyburn steps in, and, Joe gets the nomination because he's like, okay, Joe, don't be Bernie. And then Joe goes in the general and he's like, what's our plan? You're not Trump. So my advice to Joe Biden is don't be Bernie, don't be Trump, and you'll be fine.
Right. Right.
You'll be one of those two. Um, Matt, why can't we, or let me try this a different way. If we wanted to engineer a better media, what would the building blocks of that be?
Well, I mean, I think we're headed in that direction anyway. The one thing that I worry about that's a major wild card in all this is this new sort of Silicon Valley consolidation and effort at censorship, because it's heavily directed at emphasizing what they call authority. Like Google's whole plan for how it ranks and deranks content is based on this standard of what they call authority. And in order for a new system to emerge, it's going to have to be experimental first. There's going to have to be a sort of a vibrant alternative media culture, and that kind of culture could easily be artificially suppressed in this new environment, and that worries me. But absent that, I think really it's just going to take somebody recognizing that there's a huge commercial opportunity out there, because there's a massive audience of people who are disaffected, and they're both on the left and the right. They don't believe even the basics of what they're being told on whether it's Fox or CNN. It doesn't matter. So just create a channel that is. I would say start with just a basic newscast that checks its facts, worries about getting stuff right, and makes some kind of an effort to pick its stories based on issues that actually matter to ordinary people. The emphasis in especially in the last 4 or 5 years, has been to focus heavily on issues that are of primary concern to people within the Beltway, right? Like the Russia issue, nobody cared about it. Like when they actually did surveys about it, they said, what's your most important issue? Like it was less than 1% of people said the Russia thing. But people cared a lot about it inside Washington, so that if they base things around healthcare, student debt, childcare, educational quality, nutrition, opiate addiction, all these things that are people are really worried about, they're really freaked out about. If they did that, I think they would do really well. But they're not doing that yet.
Well, to your point, if you control Amazon, Google, Twitter, Facebook, Apple, and if you really want to extend it, Verizon, AT&T, and Sprint, you could literally control the world. And I had a guest on my podcast, Professor Daniel Crane from the University of Michigan Law School, and he's also still a practicing attorney in antitrust. And he's written some papers about how Hitler was able to rise to power because of the monopolies or duopolies in pre-war Germany. He had to control 2 chemical companies, 2 aircraft companies, and he did, and he compromised them, and he was able to direct them into this war effort. And I am hearing a muting of voices on the left, um, based on the the muzzling of Trump and the shutdown of Parler and such. And I've never been on Parler. I mean, I've, heard of it, but I don't know what it is. Other than a libertarian Twitter, I guess is what it is. But giving that much power to those few people is a bad thing. And the irony of this is that most of those companies, they were spawned based on an antitrust ruling that broke up AT&T, and a consent decree that limited IBM. And again, this is where good reporting would come in. Google is way past due to be broken up into multiple companies. They are in huge need of being broken up.
Yeah, and look, you add the media element to that, and it's it's a very frightening picture. There's a shocking lack of concern about this issue among people whose livelihood involves the transmission of information. I grew up in the 80s when people freaked out like it was a national emergency when Tipper Gore wanted to put labels on rock albums. And now it's like, the CEOs of Twitter and Google, and they're just zapping accounts left and right, and nobody cares, and it should be a huge issue in the press, because it's clearly something that's going to be directed, or already is being directed at us, and it's very strange that there's no uproar about this, or no fear about how it's going to be employed. Sorry to interrupt, the incident with the New York Post expose on Hunter Biden, which I didn't think was terribly important of a story, but to suppress it was a huge deal, and reporters should have been freaked out about it, and they weren't at all, which is very worrying.
Yeah, great example, and the suppression of it made it more like, why don't they want this out? I thought the tale about how the laptop got to the FBI was far-fetched. You threw them in there, although there was no denial from anybody about that, whether the emails were authentic or not. So somebody needs to get in there and go, okay, the emails are good, but that's not how they got out into the public sphere at all. That, or the emails are bogus, and the whole story is terrible.
Well,
but that's kind of fallen off too.
It appears they weren't bogus, but you're right. I think the story about how they came out was unsatisfactory for sure. But the sort of unilateral idea that yes, we should just suppress that story. It's like, what? I mean, it's so crazy that people were for that in our business. It was shocking to me.
Well, the first test case, I think, of making a non-person, and you lived in, was it Soviet Russia at the time, or was it?
I went to school for a year in the Soviet Union, and then after that it was Russia.
Okay. So making a person a non-person, and Alex Jones, who is an idiot, and an inflammatory guy, but simultaneously taking him off of every major platform. And I looked at that and I said, well, not really disappointed to see him go, but boy, does that speak to the power and kind of getting it dialed in. So, frankly, you or me, we could, any of us could be knocked off, could be made a non-person. And then, well, what's the next step? Well, you know what? JP Morgan and Bank of America, Comerica Bank, they don't want you to be a card customer. And think about that there's a lot of power being consolidated in a few places, and we don't have that traditional role of journalism. And so when I read your writing about the narrative first, and then let's go get a story and drop it into the narrative, versus let's go and find out where the facts take us and write it, no matter whose ox are being gored. I really feel strongly we need to get back to that. I do think there's an appetite for that in the country. I do think there's an appetite for, balance and plain speaking. The police chief in the city of Detroit, great guy. He would talk about pearl clutching. There was a series of home invasions in the southwest side of Detroit where the home invaders were shot by the homeowners. And his basic attitude was, look, we can't be every place all the time, so we're pretty happy about this. And it was like, wait, you can't say that. It's like, well, actually we can. He's a good guy, Democratic guy in a very Democratic city. But he's trying to keep people alive and keep the bad guys out of your house. So, but he was breaking from doctrine that guns are bad, and they are bad misused, but they are also a tool, and we have to get to that kind of discussion. Matt, I hope that you will continue to be bold. I hope you'll continue to be successful, write more books, write more articles. I'd be delighted to share more of your work here. And, perhaps we can think this through about becoming part of or helping support a turn in journalism back to that very important role that the framers had in mind.
Oh, well, thank you, Rich. I really appreciate it. And thanks for having me on.
Is there anything that we didn't cover today that you think that
I think we hit most of the key points. So that's cool. Excellent.
Well, let me make this an official sign off. This is Rich Helppie with our special guest, Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone and author and many other publications. Look him up on Substack. I guarantee you won't be disappointed. He is a factual guy, and he's not trying to win your approval. He's just trying to do a great job as a journalist. This is Rich Helppie signing off, The Common Bridge.
Thank you for watching Richard Helppie's Common Bridge. Please click the subscribe button below. Also, tune into our podcast, Richard Helppie's Common Bridge, on Apple, iHeart, Amazon, and others. Also, be sure to visit us online at richardhelppie.com.